I was 18 when my life was stolen. I remember that night with a clarity that haunts me. The sound of sirens, slicing through the quiet streets. The flash of lights against my bedroom window. The sudden pounding on the door. I thought it was a mistake at first. Maybe a neighbor needed help. Maybe it was someone looking for someone else. But when the police barged in, their faces hard and their words sharp, I realized the nightmare had already begun. They accused me of a triple homicide. 3 lives taken in a single night. And somehow, I was the one they wanted. I tried to speak, to tell them I had been at home, that I had nothing to do with it, that someone had made a terrible mistake. But my protests were ignored, my alibi dismissed. They treated me like a criminal before a court had even convened, like the weight of their suspicion could fill the gaps in evidence that didn't exist. I remember sitting on my bedroom floor, the cuffs cold against my wrists, thinking about my family, my parents, my little sister. How would they survive this? How could they even begin to believe the accusations leveled against me? And then came the ride in the squad car. The dizzying blur of city streets at night. The harsh fluorescent light of the interrogation room. I was tired, terrified, and utterly alone. The questioning was relentless. They asked me over and over again, as if repetition could force a truth that wasn't there. They showed me photos, described evidence, tried to trick me into confessing to something I didn't do. Every leading question felt like a trap. Every pause in their voices a threat. I realized quickly that they didn't want my version of events. They wanted a confession. And nothing else mattered. By morning I was exhausted. My mind spun with fear, confusion, and disbelief. How had my life gone from normal teenage worries to being accused of taking lives I had never touched? I thought about the girls in school, my friends, my future. I had been 18, just starting to dream, just beginning to plan. And now, in a single night, everything had been ripped away. When the arresting officer read the charges aloud, the words felt surreal. Capital murder. Life imprisonment. Life imprisonment. Those words echoed in my ears like a drumbeat, pounding down every corner of my being. The officers didn't notice the tears streaking my face. They didn't notice my trembling hands. To them, I was already guilty. To the world outside, I would soon become a statistic, a young woman swallowed whole by a system that didn't care to know her story. And so it began. My life as a prisoner before I had ever set foot in a cell. My innocence irrelevant, my youth already lost. That night, 18 years old, I learned that justice is not always blind. It can be cruel and it can be fast. And it can destroy everything you thought you knew about your life in a single heartbeat. The courtroom smelled of stale wood polish and tension. I remember stepping inside for the first time, feeling the weight of every pair of eyes, some curious, some suspicious, some outright hostile pressing down on me. At 18, I was a girl in a world meant for adults. A world that had already decided I was guilty. From the start, the trial was a blur of formalities and grim faces. The prosecutor's voice rang sharp and commanding, recounting a story that painted me as a killer, a monster, someone capable of violence I had never known. There were diagrams, maps, and charts, none of which proved anything against me, but presented in the right way. They created doubt for the jury in the wrong direction, doubt of my innocence. The witness against me was my own undoing. A young man, nervous and unsure, whose recollection of the night had shifted and changed every time he spoke. At first, he said he saw me at the scene. Later, he admitted uncertainty. Then later still, he insisted he had been pressured by detectives. But the court heard only the first story, the one that matched the prosecution's narrative. I tried to speak, tried to explain the inconsistencies, but the judge's gavel silenced me. I was young. I was inexperienced. I was invisible in that room. My lawyer, kind enough, tried to fight for me, but the system was stacked. He pointed out the absence of physical evidence, the lack of fingerprints, the gaps in the witness's story. But it felt like shouting into a storm. The jury nodded politely. The court stenographer tapped mechanically, and the world outside continued, oblivious to the life that was being destroyed within these walls. I remember the sentencing vividly. Guilty on all counts. The words reverberated like a hammer, pounding into every corner of my body. Life imprisonment. I felt my world collapse. A future I hadn't yet lived ripped away in a single crushing moment. My parents' faces in the gallery were pale, devastated. My sister hid behind her mother, whispering my name. But nothing could undo what had already been done. I was taken from the courtroom in handcuffs, escorted past the faces of strangers who stared without empathy. Outside, the sky was the same shade of blue I remembered from that morning. But to me, it felt distant, almost imaginary. The world I had known, the one with laughter. School, first loves, plans for the future had ended. A new world had begun, one with walls, iron bars, and the unrelenting monotony of life as a prisoner. In the back of my mind, I whispered one word repeatedly: innocent. 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 No matter how many people doubted it, no matter how long the jury deliberated or how many lawyers shook their heads, I knew the truth. I had done nothing wrong. And somehow, somewhere I promised myself that truth would matter again. The first day inside was worse than anything I had imagined. The gates loomed like a fortress. The bars gleamed under harsh fluorescent lights, and the air smelled of disinfectant, sweat, and despair. I was 18, and the walls of my new world seemed to stretch, higher than the sky I had last seen that morning. Every step echoed, every shout bounced off concrete, reminding me that I was no longer outside. I was trapped. The women I met that first day looked at me with suspicion. Some were hardened, carrying scars visible and invisible. Others were younger like me, but with eyes that had seen too much too soon. I quickly learned the rules. Keep your head down. Don't trust too easily. And never, ever show weakness. Survival in prison wasn't about innocence. It was about endurance. I was assigned a bunk in a small cell, sharing it with a woman named Carla. She had been inside for 10 years and spoke in clipped sentences, observing me with quiet calculation. I tried to introduce myself, but she only nodded, warning me not to expect kindness. In that moment, I realized that trust had a price I couldn't yet pay. Meals were mechanical tray after tray of bland food served under watchful eyes. The clatter of metal echoed through the dining hall, a rhythm that marked the passage of time more accurately than any clock. Sleep came fitfully, broken by the screams, the shouts, the occasional fight. Privacy didn't exist. Even in the small corners of the bathroom or the tiny cracks of the cell door, you could feel the eyes of others. Always observing, always judging. The first nights were the hardest. I would lie awake on the thin mattress, listening to the distant sounds of the prison, doors slamming, guards' boots on the concrete, the low murmur of women talking in whispers. My mind replayed the trial over and over, questioning how the world could have turned against me so completely. I cried quietly, afraid of anyone seeing. In here, vulnerability could be dangerous. But amidst the fear, small connections began to form. Carla, though stern, offered guidance on navigating life behind bars. She taught me which guards to respect, which ones to avoid, and how to handle the petty cruelties that seemed to be part of every day. I learned to read people, to measure moods, to anticipate trouble before it found me. These were survival skills, and I clung to them like lifelines. Even in this place, there were glimmers of humanity. Some women shared stories, scraps of food, small gestures of kindness that reminded me I wasn't entirely alone. I started keeping a journal, scribbling my thoughts and fears, trying to preserve some part of myself that the prison couldn't take. Those early months were a constant battle between despair and determination. Every day I mourned the life I had lost. Every night I whispered to myself, I am innocent. I will survive. And slowly, painfully, I began to understand that survival here meant more than just living. It meant holding on to the part of me that the world had tried to destroy. Time in prison doesn't move the way it does outside. Days fold into nights, nights bleed into weeks, and months vanish like smoke through your fingers. But even in that endless monotony, I found ways to cling to hope, tiny sparks that kept me from being consumed by despair. I began with books. Anything I could get my hands on, I read law texts, history, novels, even cookbooks. I devoured them, not just for distraction, but as a reminder that there was still a world outside these walls, a world that I was meant to return to someday. Words became my rebellion, my private rebellion against a system that had labeled me guilty without evidence. In the margins of my books, I scribbled notes, questions, ideas, and dreams. It was a way to preserve my mind, to refuse to let it atrophy under the weight of concrete and metal. I also found unexpected family within the prison walls. Not everyone, of course. There were women who would try to break you if you let them. But some became sisters in survival. We shared small Joy's birthday cards smuggled through the commissary, whispered prayers in the dark, a quiet song hummed to pass the time. These were the moments that reminded me I was still human, that I still had a heart capable of connection even in a place designed to strip you bare. Letters became another lifeline. Some from my family, others from people who had heard about my case, or law students, or advocates who refused to forget me. Each envelope carried hope in small, fragile doses. I read and reread them until the paper softened, until the ink became part of my memory. Every word reminded me that I was not invisible, that someone, somewhere still believed in me. Prayer, too, became a quiet refuge. I am not a particularly religious person, but in the silent hours of the night, when the prison was still and the world felt far away, I whispered into the darkness, don't let this be the end of me. Don't let them win. Sometimes I cried. Sometimes I imagined walking outside again, feeling sunlight on my face without the shadow of bars. These moments were fragile, almost absurdly delicate, but they were mine. They were proof that I was still alive in every sense that mattered. And yet, hope was never simple. Some nights, despair would claw its way in, reminding me of all I had lost. My youth, my freedom, my family, the life I had never lived. Appeals came and went, letters went unanswered. Witnesses moved on with their lives while mine remained frozen in that cell. It was cruel, relentless, and exhausting. Still, I survived. Not because the system cared, not because justice was on my side, but because I refused to let it erase me. I clung to the one truth the world could not touch. I was innocent. That truth became my anchor, my shield, and my promise to myself that someday, somehow, I would be free and my story would be heard. Decades passed like shadows stretching across my cell walls. Every year, the hope that had sustained me seemed thinner, more fragile, like the last candle flickering before it dies. Yet even in the darkest corners of prison, change has a way of finding you when you least expect it. Mine came quietly, at first a letter from a law student, curious about my case, asking if I remembered details that might have been overlooked. I almost didn't respond. After 40 years, I had learned that hope could be poisonous if it was unfulfilled. But something inside me stirred, and I answered. That letter opened a door. Slowly, meticulously, a legal team began to dig into the case. uncovering inconsistencies that had been buried in the original investigation. Witness statements that didn't match, evidence that had never been tested properly, confessions and recantations that had been ignored. I read every new report with trembling hands, afraid to imagine the life-changing possibility that lay within these pages. 40 years. 40 years spent proving nothing to people who refused to see the truth. And now, perhaps, there was a path forward. Every hearing became a delicate balance of hope and fear. Could this be real? Or would it be another dead end? Another cruel reminder that the world had already written me off. I felt like a tightrope walker over an endless chasm. One misstep, one unanswered question, and everything could collapse. Yet the law students, the lawyers, and the investigators never faltered. They treated me as a person worthy of justice, not as a statistic or a cautionary tale. Their faith became contagious, and I allowed myself to believe, if only a little. I remembered the day the key witness recanted their testimony in court. I was sitting in the back, heart pounding so loudly I thought it might echo through the entire building. The words were simple but seismic. The story I had been condemned for was not true. The room seemed to hold its breath as the judge listened. For the first time in decades, I felt that fragile, almost impossible feeling, relief. A crack in the walls of a system that had imprisoned not just my body, but my very life. And yet, there was something undeniable about this moment. The system, flawed and slow, had finally been forced to acknowledge the truth. I was innocent. After more than 4 decades, I was finally being given the chance to reclaim a life that had been stolen from me. I had waited a lifetime for this, but I knew that the hardest part was only just beginning. Not simply leaving the prison walls, but stepping into a world that had moved on without me, and demanding that it recognize my humanity, my years, my pain. Even after all this time, I was ready to fight for it. The day they finally opened the gates for me, I couldn't breathe. 43 years had passed, more than half my life, and yet, here I was, stepping into sunlight that felt like a stranger's embrace. I blinked, overwhelmed by brightness, by air that wasn't recycled and cold, and by the sheer reality that I was free. For so long, freedom had been an abstract dream, a story I told myself in whispers at night. Now it was real, yet fragile. Like a glass sculpture I feared might shatter at any moment. The world outside had moved on without me. Cities had grown, streets had changed, and the people I had loved most, my family, were mostly gone. My parents, who had visited as often as they could, were no longer alive to see this moment. I had missed their aging, their illnesses, their final breaths. I had been imprisoned not just in body but in time, and the cost was staggering. There were tears, of course, and silence, and a strange mix of relief and sorrow that I had never known before. The law declared my innocence, finally correcting a mistake that should never have happened. But the system refused to recognize the true scale of what it had stolen from me. Missouri law offered compensation only when DNA evidence proved a wrongful conviction existed. My case had none. No physical proof. No traces of the crime to validate my freedom in the eyes of the state. I was innocent, yet the state would pay me nothing for the decades it had stolen. 43 years of my life erased in the cold arithmetic of law. It felt like another kind of punishment. Another reminder that the system's conception of justice often failed the people it claimed to protect. Even as anger and grief threatened to consume me, I refused to be crushed. I began to speak out, not just for myself, but for everyone like me. The innocent, the forgotten, the silenced. I met journalists, lawyers, activists, anyone willing to listen. My story became part of a larger conversation about wrongful convictions, prison reform, and the cruel loopholes in laws meant to compensate the innocent. Every telling of my experience felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. rewriting the narrative the system had tried to impose. Freedom, I realized, was not simply stepping outside prison walls. It was learning to navigate a world that had continued without me, demanding acknowledgement of my life, my pain, and my resilience. It was reclaiming my identity, rebuilding connections, and finding purpose after decades of forced stasis. Even now, I am haunted by what I lost: my youth, my family, the life I could have lived. But I am also strengthened by what I endured. I survived when the world counted me out. I endured when hope seemed foolish. And I emerged not as a victim, but as a witness, a living testament to the failures of justice and the resilience of the human spirit. I am free, I am innocent, and I will not be silent.